Welcome everyone to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the Uw-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for UW Extension and Cooperative Extension, and on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, Wisconsin Public Television, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce to you three dairy scientists from here at UW-Madison. The first is Samantha Weaver. She's from Northfield, Minnesota, and she got her undergraduate degree here at UW-Madison, and she's now a PhD grad student. The second person is Stephanie Metzler. She's from Akron, Ohio. She went to Ohio State University to study animal sciences, and she's here as a PhD student at UW-Madison. And then Professor Laura Hernandez from the Dairy Science Department. She was born and raised in El Paso, Texas. She went undergrad at New Mexico State University at Las Cruces and got her PhD at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And then she came here to UW-Madison. Tonight, they're going to talk about udder anatomy and physiology. We get to have a dissection of an udder. I've never seen it before. As a plant person, I'm looking forward to it. Please join me in welcoming all three researchers to Wednesday Night at the Lab.
Thank you, Tom, for this opportunity. I figured it would be more fun if we were a little unconventional, because I tend to be somewhat unconventional at times. And we're not going to use a PowerPoint. Going kind of old school today, and I really wanted to include my grad students. They're both senior grad students in the lab, and they do some different things, and we're going to kind of start with the intro to why mammals are mammals. That's the fun part, and I'm going to try to give you the highlights of what I spend an entire semester teaching in the fall here to undergraduates in our program. So I'm a mammary gland biologist. I'm proud to say that I love studying mammary glands and how they work, and I'm all right with that after 10 years. So I've been here for 5 years, and we basically in our lab study how serotonin regulates mammary gland function as well as milk production. But as I said, I'm mostly very interested in just the mammary gland as a whole and why mammals are mammals. And many students start off in my class and they ask, why is a mammal a mammal? And a mammal is a mammal because they have mammary glands. And a lot of people don't know that, which is quite interesting. But basically, at some point in time, many millions of years ago, there was an evolution of what was going on in terms of species on this planet. And actually, we started off with the egg-laying animals that laid eggs, and they were secreting fluids potentially into this eggs that would give nutrients to the baby. And at some point over the course of evolution, the species started to evolve in order to better take care of their young. And that is why at one point the mammals kind of broke off. However, we do have a very interesting creature who belongs to the monotreme family, known as the platypus. And the platypus is somewhere between probably a chicken or a lizard or an egg-laying animal and an actual mammal. So they still lay eggs, and they do secrete a milk-like fluid. However, they just do it along their belly. So they don't quite have the nipple situation going on, and they do it along the length of their belly. And they are only found mostly in Australia and New Zealand and those types of places. But they're kind of the last link to reptiles, so to speak. Then we have my favorite mammal, or marsupial, would be coming from the ancestors. So we have our ancestor tree here, and we've got marsupials, placental mammals, which we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about, particularly the dairy cow. And then the monotremes. And so the monotremes would be your platypus, and so they're still laying eggs. The marsupials are the pouch creatures, and they are about the coolest thing I can think of. And if ever in my life I was able to actually study them, I would, because they're very, very unbelievable in what they can do. So they have their young, very, very young in development. Their joeys are born about 28 days into gestation, and they're about this big, and they're very red. And so when they're born, oddly enough, they're born with very long arms. And they're able to crawl out of the uterine cavity through the vagina when they're born, and they go into their pouch. and they attach to a nipple in the pouch. And in this, the marsupial is really cool because she can have a joey that is just barely born and make a very unique milk. And then she can have a joey that's 250 days old and make a completely different milk in the same mammary system. So each unit is its own compartment, and it's able to adjust based on the demands of the young. And that's largely, Sam will actually cover some of that when she gets to her part, but that's largely what we study in our lab. So when an animal is actually lactating, she's able to control everything just by the demand of the infant. So we'll talk more about that as we go through the presentation. So they're really unique in their capability to do that, and they can make these completely different milks. The mammary glands are really different during those time periods, and they're just a really neat situation to study. The other thing to note is that actually the mammary gland genome is like one of the most conserved kind of genomes out there. Like alpha-lactalbumin, which we'll talk about, is a sugar in milk, or drives the sugar production in milk. It's a protein. It is highly, highly conserved across all the species. So that's also very interesting, but gets back to the fact that the drive was to have something to support the baby so that they could go off and actually survive. So those guys are primarily also in Australia and New Zealand, but there are, like, possums would be similar as well. And then we have our normal placental mammals. Placental mammals are very, very diverse. You go from something which Rodentia would be the most common, and they are the most numerous as well. So rodents are the largest class of mammals. There's many kinds. There's lots of them of all different sizes. Then we have bats. Bats are also mammals, and they fly, but they also produce milk. And so very, very diverse. Then you have things like your aquatic mammals. Seals, whales, they also nurse their young. And what's really, really cool about mammals is that they can make their milk however they want depending on what environment they live in. So for instance, a whale, she will nurse her young once and go off and forage for 6 weeks for food, to have food so she can sustain herself. But her milk is so nutrient dense, primarily in fat, it's between 50 to 60% fat, that the young can survive on that while she's gone. Whereas a human, she has quite low fat percentage, and we'll look at the comparisons of human and goat and cow and some of the nut milks that are out there. But she's going to have far less fat because she's feeding more constantly, as would a rodent. So it's highly variable depending also on their access to water. So camels, for instance, do not have a lot of access to water, and their milk is going to be more nutrient dense because they want to give just what they need to give in order to support that young for that period of time. And they're able to do this based on what they're eating, on the environment they live in, and they can adjust to that depending on the scenario. And it really is just quite an unbelievable phenomenon that a female animal can do that. And that's what really got me into loving mammary gland biology. So we have these species. As I said, they're quite different. I want to talk a little bit about how the mammary gland develops. So most tissues, organs in your body when you're born, they're pretty much where they need to be. You have what you need, and it's not going to change other than really kind of growing with your body size as you grow. The mammary gland's really different. So here we have what we call our hormones of lactation. And I'm going to talk primarily about the systemic part, so how the mammary gland develops after a female animal is born. And then Sam will take over with part of the udder dissection, and she'll get into how it's controlled during lactation and some of those things I was mentioning earlier. And then Steph's going to come in and talk about how the mammary gland protects itself, and what the immune system is, and how she's able to how it's able to defend itself, particularly with some respect to dairy cows and how they work and how that's going to go. So we have all these different hormones. The female animal's born. She has a mammary gland that is very similar to a male in structure. And in fact, you can induce males to lactate. When they're older, it's a hormone cocktail. It works. Also, male babies sometimes can be born expressing milk called witch's milk. Any of you guys heard of that? And that can happen if they have an overexposure to hormones during the birth as well. So it really is a hormonal cascade that is occurring that is developing this tissue. So what happens is the female is going to go along and she's going to hit puberty. And up until that point, you don't see much change in the structure of the mammary gland itself. It kind of looks like a picked grape branch, so to speak. So after you pick all your grapes, that's pretty much what you have left over in the tissue. And that's what a rudimentary type mammary gland looks like. Once a female starts going through the menstrual cycle or the estrus cycle, depending on what species you're in, you'll start to see some growth of this like naked looking tree, grape tree, or maybe a new tree that you've planted that's never had leaves before. And so it starts to grow and it's getting bigger, and this duct system that's structuring itself is going to be fundamental to getting the milk out of the mammary gland. And Sam will focus on the epithelial cell, which it's connected to, and how that works. So it's building this ductal structure, but it's not growing quite a lot. Then as the female enters her menstrual or estrus cycle, as the estrogen and the progesterone are going through their waves of increases and decreases, you're going to see more and more growing, but it's very small. So a female, a human female, will about 21, 22 years of age, that's about the maximal kind of naked structure you would have prior to getting pregnant. So most of the development of the mammary gland is going to really occur during pregnancy. And what happens is there's going to be a very large change in the hormone cascade that's occurring as a result of the pregnancy that is going to change the structure of the tissue so that when the female gives birth, she's ready to lactate. So we start with what we call mammogenesis, and during the early first, second trimester of a pregnancy, any kind of pregnancy, they're just shorter or longer depending on what species you're in, you're going to start to see this gradual increase in this ductal structure, and it's going to keep growing. It's going to get secondary branches and tertiary branches, and then it's going to start to kind of sprout or form its alveolar structures, which Sam will talk about how they work during lactation. So they continue to grow and proliferate, and they're going to populate that tissue that's sitting there. And largely that tissue that's kind of hanging out that doesn't have much in it is usually what we call the fat pad. And depending on what species you're in, you're going to have more fat or less fat. So humans have quite a bit of fat. Rodents have some more. Cows do not have very much in their mammary gland. In fact, they're mostly just the fat pad and a lot of connective tissue, which you'll see some of that when they start to break it apart. So the tissue is quite different than a mouse mammary gland or even a human mammary gland. So what happens is this continues to grow, and when you get to the last stage of pregnancy, your progesterone's quite high, your estrogen's starting to come down, but it's also high, and you start to see differentiation of the cells. And Sam will show you what the differentiated cell looks like, but a normal mammary epithelial cell that's not functioning looks like your typical square with the dot in the middle of it, and with your nucleus and your cytoplasm, and you can't really see your organelles very well. But that last trimester, those cells start to get bigger, they start to elongate and become more columnar looking, and they start to talk to like the connective tissue and the adipocytes as well as through the blood, and they're going to be changing, and your mitochondria are going to get huge, and your Golgi is going to get huge. It's going to have to make a lot of protein, and all of these organelles are going to become quite large, and when you look at them on the microscope, you can drastically see how different they are. So at the end, depending on what species you're in what we call lactogenesis phase 1. And at this point, you would see some lipid droplets forming inside the cells, and depending in a cow, about a week before she gives birth, give or take a few days, you'll start to see some milk actually leaking out. In a human, this would not necessarily happen, and in fact, unfortunately for humans who think too much, clearly, they don't have their lactogenesis start until after they give birth. And this actually becomes a problem in the clinic or in the hospital, because if they don't start to milk within that first 24 hours, they're like, I'm done. Cannot feed my baby, I'm done. And so the 72-hour time point is really important in the human population, but cows will actually start to secrete a little bit before they give birth. So usually when they give birth, they're ready to go, which unfortunately couldn't be the opposite, because they're probably not thinking about it so much. But So that starts to happen, and at this point, they're really forming colostrum. And we go through this early phase once they give birth. They have their colostrum, which is 24 to 48 hours, and then we don't really start collecting mature milk on farms until at least 5 days in milk, because there's a lot of changes in the composition that occur during that time period, and then it gets to a more consistent mature milk. And this is normal in most species that you would see this, and that colostrum is what's really important to the baby. In cows in particular, where they don't get any immunoglobulin transfer across their placenta, the colostrum is the only place they're going to get it. Humans at least get some from the placenta, but cows don't. And so this is really important to their health and how we make sure that that milk is what they get and that it's adequate, that they can start off well in life as well. So with that, I'm going to switch to Samantha, and she's going to talk to you about the systemic portion, or the local portion, autocrine, paracrine portion of the mammary gland, and then we'll break down the epithelial cell as well.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to do the fun stuff, which is actually touching the udder, and Steph's going to do the fun stuff too. Laura gets paid to have us do the fun stuff. So I am really excited to talk to you guys today because I'm going to talk to you about what I research, which is what is going on at the local level of the mammary gland. So like Laura mentioned, there are lots of systemic hormones like estrogen and progesterone that have a big influence on the tissue growing. But during lactation, the vast majority of those hormones get way suppressed down. And the only hormones that are really ramping up during lactation at a whole body level are prolactin, which is responsible for keeping the cow milking, or a human or anything, and oxytocin. And I'll explain a little bit more about oxytocin in a minute. Are there any farmers here or former dairy people? Excellent. So you guys know that this is not an udder. This is only a quarter of one udder. So Steph and I each have a quarter. I'm just going to orient you real quick because that'll make it easier. So this cow was slaughtered yesterday. So this tissue is very fresh. We haven't had it in formaldehyde, anything. It's just fresh tissue. So if I flip it over, you'll see right here is a teat. So you can orient it this way. This is how the udder would actually be sitting on the cow. And it's easy for me to grab up here at the top of the udder because there are incredibly thick, strong tissues up here, ligaments, that hold the mammary gland in place, essentially. So if you think about the way that a cow's built, short of me getting down on all fours, you all know what I mean, she needs a lot of connective tissue to hold that mammary gland up into her body. And the mammary gland, like I said, this is a pretty small mammary gland for a cow. They can be just enormous. So if you think about that proportional to how much weight that cow has to hold up, her ligaments are incredibly strong, holding the udder up on her body. So Steph's going to talk to you more about the teat. I'm going to leave the teat alone for now. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the local factors that regulate what's going on in the udder, and I'll do that by sort of talking you through the udder itself. So up in here, all this just white tissue, basically, is called parenchyma. So parenchyma is essentially the area of the tissue that's responsible for making the milk. Parenchyma has epithelial cells in it. Epithelial cells, mammary epithelial cells, are the milk-producing units of the mammary gland. So if you can sort of follow my diagram here, which, sorry, it's sort of small, you have milk coming out at the teat, like I mentioned. So the milk is going to be getting ejected down here. This is the same system, by the way, in the human. It's just that the mammary gland goes the other way, but it's the exact same system. So you have your epithelial, or excuse me, your parenchymal tissue, which is all this big conglomeration of tissue up here. And within the parenchymal tissue, you have epithelial cells. So an epithelial cell is the functional unit that actually makes the milk. And I'll talk through sort of what goes on in an epithelial cell because it's absolutely amazing. The epithelial cells are forming a big fat ring, and that ring is an alveoli. So the other place that you have alveoli in your body, or a cow does, is in your lungs. So the alveoli need to snap open when a baby is born, for example, to allow you to breathe. The alveoli in the mammary gland fill up with milk. So they're teeny, teeny, tiny. We can only view them on the microscope. There's no way you could see them with the naked eye. And those are the grapes, like Laura was talking about, the grape tree. The grapes are the alveoli. each one of those alveoli is surrounded by a ring of mammary epithelial cells. Those alveoli empty into exactly what she described, which is a tree. There's a whole series of ducts that wind their way down to the bottom, or the teat cistern, in a cow, and then the milk empties out of the teat. So if we look right here, Steph's going to talk to you a little bit more about the cistern for immunological reasons, but you can see that it actually looks like Swiss cheese. So in the teat cistern itself, there are essentially a whole series of holes that just open up, and those are connecting to tubes that then connect to bigger tubes that then connect to other tubes that eventually lead up to the alveoli. And all those tubes empty down into the teat cistern. There's actually still milk in this udder, so if I were to palpate it enough, I'm sure we would get out a sufficient amount of milk. So the mammary epithelial cell is pretty amazing because the mammary gland, short of long-chain fatty acids, makes everything itself. So think of all the things that we think about when we think about milk. There's fat, there's calcium, there's tons of protein, there's vitamins. All of those pieces are put together in the mammary epithelial cell. So the mammary gland receives everything in its single unit components. So protein is made up, for example, of amino acids. Those amino acids travel through the circulation, they arrive at the mammary gland, and only in the mammary epithelial cell is everything put together. So the mammary gland has this incredible synthetic capacity, and that it's able to pretty much make everything that it needs to make right at the place that it needs it. And that's important when you have, for example, I was going to say pups because I work with mice. You can milk a mouse. We have a milk mousing machine. A mouse milking machine. Laura built it. It's just a little vacuum. You just flip them upside down and vacuum them. Should have brought that. Next year, we'll be back with our mouse milker. So it's really the stimulation at the level of the teat that gets everything put together, that gets everything synthesized and ready to go in the milk. And a pretty fun statistic about that is that in order to produce 1 unit of milk, so we'll do a liter, you need 500 liters of blood. So if you've ever seen a dairy cow, she has these whopper big veins that run all the way up her body. You all kind of know what I'm talking about. They look like snakes. I mean, they're just huge along her underbelly. And that's because she has enormous demands for blood during lactation in order to provide enough nutrients, amino acids, building blocks to be able to synthesize everything in the gland. So, what else do you want me to talk about? She's the boss. Anything else? Steph, why don't you take over?
Okay, so and I am going to talk a little bit about how we keep dairy cows healthy. Laura is actually my co-advisor. My other advisor is Dr. Pamela Ruig. She works with mastitis, which is inflammation of the mammary gland, which is something that we definitely don't want because we want our cows to be as healthy as possible, producing as much milk as possible. That's the best product we can get out to consumers. So the first line of defense, because dairy cows they lay down for most of the day. They eat, they lay down, they chew their cud, they let that blood flow and get to the mammary gland so they can produce as much lactose and protein as possible. So the first defense is the skin, which is obviously all over the outside of the cow. So you can see here that we have the skin, and there's some hair here. The teats themselves don't have hair on the outside, but the rest of the udder does. And then our next line of defense, because nothing's going to get in through that skin unless we have an injury or something, which doesn't really happen, so we don't need to worry about that so much. But there is a tiny, tiny little hole in the very tip of the teat, and this is called our streak canal or teat canal. And there's this little sphincter muscle there that closes, and it kind of folds in on itself so that nothing can get through there. And I think you might be able to see it here. There's kind of a thicker, let's see, kind of a thicker part here. Right here would be where that sphincter muscle is. But during milking, that sphincter muscle will be opening so that the milk can actually come out of the teat into the milking machine. So then there's another physical barrier in there, which is called keratin. And keratin is comprised of proteins and fatty acids that are secreted by the skin cells right in this street canal. And this will kind of trap bacteria like a net. And then those fatty acids can actually kill some of the bacteria. So our number one way of keeping the udder healthy is by just not allowing bacteria in the first place. And they're pretty good at it. So that is great. But what happens if you actually have bacteria that get into the mammary gland? Past these external defenses. This is where we have some cellular defenses. It's kind of the same immune system that you would see in humans. The mammary epithelial cells that Sam talked about that are all up here, they have a lot of cell surface receptors. So they can find something that's conserved on a lot of bacteria. For example, bacteria like E. coli. That has a molecule called lipopolysaccharide. And that's really common to a lot of bacteria, whether they're good bacteria, bad bacteria. So these mammary epithelial cells will detect that lipopolysaccharide and send out some molecules of their own that attract these neutrophils. And neutrophils have these big purple nuclei that are lobed so that they can squeeze out of the blood and into the milk more easily. And then they will kill bacteria. They can ingest the bacteria and lyse them with reactive oxygen species or perchlorate, so they actually can produce bleach within the cells on a much smaller scale, obviously, than you would use to clean your house. But that's essentially what they do at a tiny, tiny molecular level. So these neutrophils are going to kill bacteria. And the way that we can tell if a dairy cow has an infection in her udder is prior to milking. Every time a cow is milked, the first thing that the milker will do is forestrip, is what we call it, which is where you take the teat and you just squeeze it a little bit and you look at the milk that comes out of that. Usually there's a black surface underneath the cow to make it easier to see. You look and see if the milk looks normal. And if you have any kind of chunks or clots in there, that cow's milk is not going to go into the bulk tank with all the rest of it. That's not going to get sold to the public. She's going to be put in a separate pen, milked at the end, and then that milk will not be sold to anyone. We can collect milk samples and try to find out which bacteria are actually causing this infection. So we'll take a milk sample, we'll plate it in our lab, we'll check it 24 hours later, and we can identify these bacteria because we have a few common ones that we look out for. So we can identify these bacteria, and then if we have certain bacteria, we might want to administer some intramammary antibiotics. And I know there's a lot of talk about antibiotics in milk. Oh my gosh, antibiotics in milk. Well, they're only administered through the mammary gland, and then once you have administered antibiotics to a cow, you put a red leg band on her, so that signifies that she cannot be milked with all the rest of the cows. This milk with the antibiotic residues, that will get dumped. If you try to put a cow with antibiotic residues in your bulk tank milk, all those tanks get tested at your milk processor. That milk will get dumped and the farmer's going to get in big trouble. It costs a lot of money and there's a lot of incentive for producers not to put antibiotics in milk. So every load gets tested. There's no antibiotic residues in the milk. The antibiotics all have withdrawal periods, and we also watch for the return of the milk to normal appearance. So that way, the milk that doesn't have residues and is back to a normal appearance, so this cow's healthy again, that's when she can go back into the group with all her buddies and go back into the bulk tank, and we can sell that milk again. What else? Oh, I also have, changing the subject from the antibiotic residues, you know when you go to the doctor and you have a sore throat and they feel your throat to see if they can feel your tonsils if they're swollen? I have a lymph node from the mammary gland here. So there's a lot of lymph nodes because we want to activate this immune system and keep all our bacteria out of here. So this is how big a lymph node would be that's at the top of the udder. And then when you cut it down the middle, it has a lot of fluid flowing through it, and you can kind of see it's this dark color. And then this is where some immune cells will get activated, and the body will say, hey, these are the bacteria we need to kill, so let's educate you on how to kill them. So this is kind of the training center for some of our immune cells. So I think that is most of what I wanted to say about the immune system.
Yes. So I want to mention a couple things before I get into this. So we decided as we were putting this together, we give you a short overview and then we try to discuss some things that are out there in the market. One thing I wanted to mention about lactation in general was, as Sam was saying, we have all these separate individual units, and I mentioned how the marsupials were really kind of an extreme but beautiful example of how the mammary gland can adapt. But the mammary gland, the more often you milk it or the more often you nurse a baby, the more milk you're going to produce. And that's going to always be at the expense of whatever else is going on with the mom. Whether she eats enough or she doesn't eat enough, she will make that milk. And so your dietary choices can influence the milk that's going to be produced. And that'll become important in a second when I bring up the humans. Cows, clearly, especially dairy cows, are on a fairly regimented diet. You will get some variability in milk, say from places like Ireland or New Zealand, where they have grazing systems and they put their cows out on pasture, because the biggest component that varies that I alluded to earlier on in milk is fat. And that's largely due to where you are in your environment, the size of the animal, but largely how often you feed your baby is a big part of that. So there can be different fat flavors that come up, or different fat structures that are in different grasses that can affect the flavor of milk. And that's going to be the most thing that you would notice. And also, has anyone ever heard of liquid gold? No, colostrum. We have. Yes. Woo! Colostrum has lots of fat and lots of protein, and it's largely that color. It has to do with the amount of protein and fat that is in the milk. So depending on what kind of fats you eat, and you're going to adjust the way the milk may taste. And that's why actually we don't use a lot of fish oils in our cow diets, because that flavor can be conveyed to your product that you will taste. So there's a lot of things that we can manage with milk, you know, to make it more palatable or make it more interesting or flavorful, just on how we feed an animal or how often we milk an animal, or many, many different ways we can do that. The other thing I wanted to note is that the mother is quite exceptional at dealing with this. She changes a lot of things in her body that is all due to signals that are coming from the mammary gland during the lactation. So the mammary gland is going to be making all these local factors that Sam talked about, and they're going to be sending the signals out, and they're going to say, I need more calcium, so I'm going to take your bone tissue. I don't care, I'm going to take it. And actually all mammals lose bone during lactation, every single one of them, because there's not enough that you can eat to compensate. And that's actually largely what we study, which is why I had to pitch it. But no, we do study a lot of other things too. And similarly, if you're underfed, you're going to pull your adipose tissue or your muscle tissue to make up for what's lost. So the thing to keep in mind, particularly with dairy animals, who that is their job, whether they're goats or sheep or cows, we feed them very well. and we feed them to make sure they have enough nutrients to make the milk that they need to make, but also be healthy. And if someone is not doing that, they're not going to have an animal that is going to be productive, and it just won't happen. And so your really good farmers take really, really, really good care of their animals, and that's something to really keep in mind, because lactation is a very energy taxing time period, and they're going to be in negative energy balance for some time when they first give birth, anywhere from 30 to 50 days depending on the scenario. And this is a really tricky time period, and we take really good care of our animals, and if you don't, then they're not productive. And so that's something always to keep in the back of your head when we hear about how are we really managing these animals. Are they well housed? Are they well cared for? Do they have good water? Are they clean? If they aren't, they're not going to be farming for very long. It won't happen, because their animals, won't be productive, and it's not the right way to go about things. So we do take really good care of them. So I wanted to talk about some popular things. These milks have some unique properties to them. They have unique proteins. And that's one of the problems that come up, is that some people are allergic to bovine proteins. That's a real thing, and it really happens. And if that happens, then you're looking for something else to drink. A lot of times, particularly probably quite a few years ago, a lot of people would switch to goat's milk as an alternative rather than giving cow's milk to their children if they had some kind of allergy, because the proteins are different. They're goat specific. The other problem people have with is lactose. And one thing to note about lactose is that as you increase in age, the enzyme lactase that breaks down the lactose, its activity decreases. So that's why as you get older, sometimes you can't eat 18 pounds of cheese, which I would like to do, because you can't handle it. But when you're 4, like my daughter, she can probably still do it and be just fine. There are also populations like the Asian population who sometimes don't have lactase or very low levels of lactase, and they have much more difficulties breaking down cheese. So sometimes when people talk about, I'm lactose intolerant, they don't really know what that means. If you really have a true issue with lactose, it's because you can't break it down and you don't have the capability in your body. But if you like dairy products, you can go buy lactase at Walgreens or CVS or wherever and eat that right before you eat your dairy product, and you'll be fine. And that's a true lactose deficiency. If you're allergic to the monosaccharide galactose, which is a component of lactose, so lactose is a galactose plus a glucose. If you have the inability to break that down, then you have a lactose problem as well. But there are all different variations of what this actually is, and a lot of times, in general, people don't really understand what they're saying when they say they have a lactose problem. But there are like 5 different variations of this, whether it's genetic or it's just a decrease in the activity of the enzymes to break this down. So we have some different kinds of milks here. We have our cow, goat, human, and then 2 very popular types of milks that are out in the market, almond and soy. And just from what I read 3 years ago, almond milk has taken over soy. So that's like the lead vegetable or nut milk that's out there. There are a lot of milks. In our class in the fall, we do a milk testing. And there's hemp milk, there's camel milk, there's goat milk, there's soy milk, there's organic milk, there's almond milk. There's lots of milks that are on the shelf that I wonder about sometimes, but there's lots of them, and we end up picking up like 30 different kinds, and we run some tests on them, and we try to make the students taste them. Goat, you can tell right away though. You have to have a taste for goat milk or goat cheese if you really are going to consume it, because it has its own very special flavor. So when we look at this, the other thing to talk about that gets discussed about milk is that it has fat in it, or that it's a really high fat product. It's actually not. Whole milk from a cow that you would buy in the store has 3.5% fat in it. 3.5%, that's whole milk. It's not a very high fat product. It actually has 87% water. Because water is actually, the water content is driven by the amount of lactose that's in the milk. So the lactose gets made in that Golgi apparatus and it can't get out. And the only way it can get out is via osmosis. So it sucks water into the cell, and then the lactose can come out. So that's what determines the amount of water in your milk is actually the lactose content. And for a complete food, which you're trying to get back to thinking we're feeding a baby that is not able to survive on anything, you could survive on this just fine. And now like they fortify it with some stuff like vitamin D, which we'll get to in a second. But this is this is a cup of milk, I believe, is what this is based on. So you have a cup of milk and a cow's milk, and this is whole milk. So whole milk here. This would decrease depending on 2%, 1%, or skim. It has 150 calories. Goat has about half of that. Your human milk has about the same as goat, and it has more water in it. Its lactose or sugar content is actually 7% instead of 3.5% in a cow's milk. Almond milk has 40, and soy milk has 80. The thing to really kind of note here, I'm going to come down in a second, but the big thing is the protein and the fat, and that's where those nut milks really don't quite have the level of a mammalian milk. So the next big thing, as I said, is protein, and you can see here again with these gold stars, this is the highest amount. So protein, this is 8 grams of protein per 100 mils of milk. In fat, in a whole fat milk here. When you look at a goat's milk, it's only 3, and then human 1.1, and you can see almond has 1 gram, and soy has more, but with 7. But there's quite less protein in this. So if you're looking for a high protein food, I wouldn't necessarily say that they're high protein, at least compared to what cow's milk you would find on the shelf. We look at fat content, and this is again grams per 100 mil. And the thing to note too about cow's milk is depending on what dairy breed you're going with, the fat is going to be variable. So our Holsteins run 3.5% to 4% typically. You have the second most common breed would be the small little Jersey cows that look like little deer. They're very sassy. We like them though because they're very interesting to study for calcium. But they are very sassy, and they make a much higher fat and protein milk. And in Wisconsin, when you sell your milk on components, that's really important. So we're the lead cheese state in the United States. This is where cheese comes from. And we sell our milk on components. So if you have more fat, more protein, you can get a higher price. This is not true in all states. So other states are only sold on how much milk they make. So they may be more interested in having a Holstein because she makes substantially more milk volume-wise, but not necessarily on a body weight-wise, because Jerseys are actually more efficient. They, on average, make 70 to 80 pounds of milk a day, but they also have less urine, less fecal output, and require less feed. So they're more energy efficient. And this is why, actually, I think there's been an increase in the number of Jersey cows in the United States. Plus, they're also more heat tolerant. So you'll find quite a few out west because they just don't get so hot, and that's also an added benefit. But there's been a lot of talk about looking at this in terms of our footprint on the environment as a dairy industry. The next thing is clearly we're going to have saturated fat in these mammalian milks. And saturated fat is not necessarily a bad thing. Everything is a bad thing in too much entity, but that's because as mammals we make cholesterol. That's unavoidable, and if we didn't make cholesterol, that would also be a bad thing. The other thing to note about saturated fat and or cholesterol is that only 25% of the cholesterol in your circulation is really affected by your food. 75% is by what you make in your body, which is why often if you have a cholesterol issue, you would change your diet, especially if your levels are quite high. Change your diet, you change your exercise, and you're still high. It's because it's a genetic thing. It's how much you make, and that's why they put you on medication. So you can only change so much based on food, and this is not a lot. And then you can see clearly goat has 2, and then there really isn't going to be any in the other. There's not much in the human. It's negligible, and it depends on the diet is the other part with the human milk, because we're not feeding them consistently, clearly. We all like what we like, right? So carbohydrates, again, there's about 12 grams per 100 mils of carbohydrates in cow's milk, And the next highest one would be human, as I said. And so this is going to be variable, and the sugar is going to be different in these guys in the nut milks than they would be in the mammalian milks, because mammalian milks are all going to be lactose. Same thing across all species. And so, except for the marsupials, they have a little bit different thing going on because they're a little bit different, or they're cooler, at least in my opinion. But you can see that there is sugar in here, but those carbohydrates are going to be different in the nut milks than they would be in the mammalian milk. Then when we get down to calcium, the highest except for the soy, which is likely due to probably addition of calcium. So this is natural calcium in the mammalian milk. You're going to have 280 milligrams per 100 mils of milk of calcium. The calcium content is the highest mineral content in the milk. Calcium is going to be the biggest thing that's in there, and that is because, again, when we go back to why mammals are mammals, we're mammals because we have mammary glands to support our young to make sure they can go off and survive. So the biggest thing that happens in a child or a calf or a puppy or a kitten is bone growth. And they need the calcium and the phosphorus as structural components for that long bone growth that they're going to go through during this time period. And that soft tissue calcification that has to occur in a lot of situations. So almond doesn't put anything in there, so you can see there's nothing in there. And then your vitamins and your minerals are going to be a little bit different. So fat-soluble vitamin content is going to vary largely on the fat of the diet. So your vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K, particularly A, D, and E, are going to be largely dictated by what you're consuming. And in fact, cow's milk does not have a lot of vitamin D in it. And so that's why it is fortified in the United States. So we have vitamin D supplemented in our milk as a result of that. But that's going to vary depending on your diet, and then in the case of vitamin D, your exposure to sunlight, because that's going to be the primary way you're going to make vitamin D. So in humans, vitamin A and D, it's very questionable how much is going to be in there. So it depends on what the mother is eating. Cows, you can see vitamin A, this is 400 milligrams per 100 mils of milk. And then, again, soy milk is somewhat supplemented, but the other thing to note about soy milk is that it has compounds in it that have estrogen-like activity. So they're very complementary to some of the things estrogen has, so you might get some of these fat-soluble vitamins in a different way as a result of it being soy. So it's just a part of the component of what's in the plant. And then almond milk does not have any. So mostly almond milk has a little bit of protein and a little bit of fat and some sugar in it. So these are kind of the differences in what most people are out there. Again, it's going to be variable depending on what species you're in, and there's a lot of choices that come there. But mammalian milk is set up to be a complete food because of its origin. And the origin gets back to making enough milk to provide for your young, and a milk that's going to allow them to grow in an adequate way. And actually, another take-home is, don't forget, whole milk really does not have that much fat in it. It's only 3.5%, and that's something that we lose kind of sight of. That, you know, we have that there, and it's really not that much, and it's probably an amount that is not unhealthy if you aren't consuming lots and lots and lots and lots of other saturated fats. So we really wanted to talk to you kind of as a big picture with all of these things, but the take-home is that the mother dictates. And dairy cows, they're fed very well, and in the United States, they're fed a very standard diet, which is called a total mixed ration. And there's a lot of nutritionists out there tweaking and fine-tuning every little thing that they do to make sure that those cows are getting the diet that they need depending on where they are. If they're lactating, if they're pregnant, if they're not lactating, if they're growing, if they're a calf, and they're really trying to figure out what works best, and doing that based on where we are in the United States and what the feedstuffs are that are available. So you guys are really fortunate here. That's something I noticed when I came here. You have everything here. When I came from Arizona, we trucked everything in. Or we tried to get creative and use things like chili pepper remnants, or if you're in Florida, they use citrus pulp or things like that. So we do try to make use of what the agricultural inputs are in the different parts of the country. to make sure that we're feeding our animals correctly. But these total mix rations have been well studied here. This is one of the best places to be. In fact, I'd say the best place to be if you're in the dairy science world. At Cornell University, at the University of Florida, we have a lot of really good scientists that are doing really good things to look at this. So with that, we thank you. I really want to thank Sam and Steph for coming along to do this. I think it's more fun if we do it together because it's just more fun that way. And hopefully getting away from the PowerPoint didn't scare you guys too much. There was some discern I felt like from Tom when I told him we weren't going to use PowerPoints. But we wanted you guys to see this and kind of see what's going on. And we make use of this, and we do this a lot at schools and other places to educate people on how milk is made and why mammals are mammals, because that's fun, and that's what I like to study. So anyway, thank you guys.
Before you do questions, I need a favor. Back to the camera. I need 30 seconds of each graphic by itself so I can get video of it.
Each picture?
Yep.
Got it.
And you have to open your iris.
Okay.
It's really dark. Okay, and then, yeah, okay, exactly. Okay, hang on. So you guys can talk while we're doing this, but try not to put shadows on the board.
Okay.
Actually, shadows are everywhere. Who put those lights on the ceiling anyway?
You, Bruce.
Oh, okay. Didn't think about this. Okay, next.
I feel like Vanna White. Stop not in her dress.
Feel free to ask questions while we're doing.
Is there an evolutionary relationship between sweat glands and mammary gland, the alveolar structure?
Next.
That's a fantastic question. And yes, there is. There are actually. Yep, absolutely. Yes, that's a great question. So the question was, are sweat glands and mammary glands related? Mammary glands are actually a modified sweat gland. So they have apocrine secretion, and the secretion in the mammary gland varies depending on species. So one thing, Steph didn't talk a lot about somatic cells, but she was talking about health of the gland and what they do in the dairy industry when they're monitoring not only antibiotics, but it's the somatic cell count, which would be those neutrophils she showed you that are getting shed into the into the milk. So some species will actually shed their entire epithelial cell into the milk. Humans do, as do goats, which is why goats in general have a higher cell count than cows do. Cows do not. They will shed like the membrane, so the plasma membrane of their cell as they're secreting fat. So after he's done taking these pictures, I can go back to Sam's diagram, but basically when fat gets secreted, it comes up to the plasma membrane and it just kind of injects itself out and it takes a piece of that with it. But goats would take the whole cell. But this is all very similar to the sweat gland, and in fact, it evolved that they had hair follicles with the nipples, and platypus are the only ones that still do, and that's a complete derivative from the sweat gland. But now, as Steph pointed out, those teats don't have hair, and most mammals don't except the monotremes, but they have a different weird kind of secretion thing going on anyway because they're egg layers, but it's like a fluid on their belly. So yeah, that's a really great question.
You just generally mentioned it, but didn't bring it. I was interested in, you mentioned there were 5 different reasons for lactose intolerance. You named 2 of them. One is a failure to break down lactose, the other one is the failure to break down the lactose.
Right.
What are the other 3?
Right, so another one is a genetic deficiency. So in the genetic code, they're unable to either deal with galactose or, and that's the primary, is that it's a genetic deficiency. So it can be enzyme related depending on what sugar you're talking about, whether it's the disaccharide or one of the individual monosaccharides, or it could be the enzyme deficiency or lack of the enzyme or a genetic deficiency. And then the other one is, the fifth is actually just intolerance. So it's not a real, it's a real something, but it's not a complete deficiency or an issue with breaking down. It's just more of an intolerance. So maybe like an irritation of the gut or something like that.
One thing about lactose intolerance that I think is really interesting, because I study bacteria, is that if you can break down the lactose, then it doesn't get to the later part of your digestive tract as lactose. But if you don't break it down, then it gets to the later part of your digestive tract as lactose, and there are bacteria in there that ferment it. So the bacteria digest it instead of you. They ferment it, and they produce a lot of gas. And so that is what lactose intolerance is. It's kind of your gut flora turning against you, sort of.
What's changing during lactation? Why is the cow producing less milk over time? Physiologically.
That's a great question. So why does the cow produce less milk over her lactation? A dairy cow is usually, typically, and hopefully concurrently pregnant while she's lactating. So typically here, there's a voluntary waiting period after a cow gives birth, somewhere between 50 to 90 days, depending on what farm you're on and how you manage your reproductive program. And at that point, they're not pregnant. So as their lactation curve would look like, kind of like a ski slope, up and then kind of gradually down, maybe a bunny slope. But it goes up, and during that increasing time, the animal's not concurrently pregnant. Hopefully we're able to breed her back, and once we do, she's pregnant. And now she's dealing with opposing hormones. So when she's in her pregnancy stage, you don't necessarily, in normal situations where you're not concurrently pregnant and lactating, you would have progesterone suppressing the mammary gland from lactating. It would just be growing the tissue. But now you have to deal with the progesterone and the estrogen keeping the pregnancy and advancing the pregnancy. And so there's a confliction of the hormones is probably as well as the nutrient supply to having a calf and milking at the same time. So that's why as she goes later into lactation, particularly during pregnancy, you'll see a decrease in milk production.
So, but if you would not make her pregnant, would you keep milking her?
Yes.
For 1,000 days?
Yes. So can you keep milking an animal after she's not pregnant? You can, as long as you keep stimulating her. And that's
Would she produce the same amount?
if you stimulate her more often, yes. So this is directly related to frequency. So you can, no one really does it because as they become less and less productive, and if maybe she's not bred back, she's not going to be a good replacement in the herd because she's having a hard time getting pregnant. But if you were to keep them going and you increase their milking frequency, say from twice a day to 3 times a day or 4 times a day, you could keep production up because it's the signals at the level of the mammary gland. So how many times you're actually removing the milk or nursing that is going to send the stimulus back to the cells that they need to make milk. So there's a couple of theories related to that, and probably both are true. One is a pressure issue. If you don't remove the milk, you have essentially a closed system like a balloon filling up, right? And you're not removing anything, and it expands and expands and expands, and eventually it either has to turn itself off or it's going to explode. And that's really what happens. So you stop milking the animal, eventually over time, depending on how much milk they make, they will shut down secretion and start to degrade the tissue and kind of go back to, depending on what species you're in, what you look like before. In a cow, not so much. In a mouse, yes. In a human, yes. But if you remove the milk, so you have the pressure issue, but the more often you remove it, the signals that are going to maybe different growth factors that are produced by the cells. So Sam talked about those local factors, and there's lots of them that get produced in those cells. They make lots of things besides protein and fat, etc. They can build up inside too. And if you let them build up too long, they will also stimulate breakdown of the cells or cell death or something like that. But if you remove them and they stay low, you're sending the signal back that we need more. And that's directly connected to the baby, or in our case, the milking unit. So one natural way you can increase milk yield very easily is to go from 2x to 3x. And if you milk your cows twice a day and you switch to 3 times a day, if you do it over the course of an entire lactation, you'll increase your milk yield by 10%. And that's just because you're stimulating the gland more often, because there's signals that are going back to drive that. And that's specifically what we study.
Could you talk about the sow instead of the cow?
The sow?
Yeah. You talk about a lot of animals, but if you could talk about pigs.
Yes.
And their lactation. One of my big questions is how, a goat has 2, and a
Goat
cow
has 4.
How many does a sow have?
2? Yes. The sow has variable, and it depends on the litter. They can have between 12 and 14. It's not always standard. Mice have 10. Rats can have between 10 and 12, usually 10. But pigs are between 12 and 14, and this is directly related to a litter-bearing species. And this is also structure related to function, kind of the first thing you learn in biology. They're along their belly so that they can lay on the side like a dog. A dog would have 8 to 10. They're usually in pairs, depending on what breed of dog she is. So a sow will have 12 to 14, and they have a 21-day lactation typically. They're not the best lactators, and they're not the best moms from my understanding. So we actually had a new postdoc join the lab, and I didn't force her in this exercise because she's only been in the lab 2 weeks. But she came from a pig lab, and she studies maternal interactions. And so they have a hard time. They don't have enough sugar in their milk when they're born. So they have to have quite a bit of glycolytic store or be given supplemental sugar, because if not, they will become hypoglycemic and die. The other thing is iron. Pig's milk does not have a lot of iron in it, and they do not have enough iron stores, so they also have to be given iron at birth. And then they have another issue with competition. So a lot of times they have more piglets than they have mammary glands. And the littlest pig gets the short end of the stick. And there's a lot of aggression and hierarchy in piglets in doing this. But sows are not the best lactators. So they do struggle somewhat with that. And the piglets in the nursery have to be really fairly well monitored, from my understanding, as a result of that.
Moving marsupials, is that the lab logo?
That became our recent lab logo. We signed up for Crazy Legs, and these guys are always very aware of my deep obsession with marsupials. And it's kind of a joke in the lab that Laura is obsessed with marsupials. But we decided we were going to do this, and I was like, oh, it'd be cool if we were moving marsupials. And Steph's brother-in-law, actually, what's that?
His name is John DiNicola, so if he's watching, I just want to drop his name.
We didn't leave him out. But he's a graphic artist, and he designed this for us. And so we had it on our t-shirts, and this has become our lab logo because it's kind of me in a nutshell, as Sam would say.
Is the total number of cells constant during lactation? The immune cells, in absence of infection?
I wouldn't say it's constant. I mean, they stay in a range, the immune cells do, but they're going to go up and down a little bit because the animal is going to be exposed to different things. She's moving from bedding to the parlor, but for the most part, I mean, they stay pretty steady unless you have an infection, and then you'll see a large influx.
Is the number of cells very constant? Is that determined by the udder, or is it determined by the immune system as such?
The immune system is determined by the exposure from the immune system. There's an inherent number of cells there, but they're going to be recruited or having more coming in depending on exposure. So,
if there's no exposure, do you think it's constant during lactation?
that's hard to tell.
There's never no exposure.
Right. The other part is that, so during a cow's lactation, and again, this is variable across species, a cow will replace her entire epithelial cell population over the course of a 305-day lactation. So while maybe the cell number stays maybe similar, and it might change over phase depending on how much you're milking or how much you're not. Maybe there's less cells if you're producing less milk because you don't, but probably not, as you tell me. So I would say it fluctuates over, but they're not necessarily the same cells. But I don't think that you're going to get a drastically large increase during lactation unless you're exposed to something. But it's going to be variable, and they're probably not the same ones that were there at the beginning, just like the epithelial cells aren't either.
Today's dairy cows produce about twice what cows of 40 or 50 years ago did. Do people in your field know what has changed about the animals, the physiology or the anatomy that has allowed that to happen?
That's a good question. So I think that's, we know, as George just mentioned, that milk production has probably doubled in the last 40 or 50 years. I think there's a lot of things that go into that. Definitely, we've genetically selected cows for lactation traits, not so much now. They're doing other things, but that was one thing that was done at one point in time. The other part is we're doing things like artificial insemination. So we're not naturally breeding cows as much anymore. Maybe, at least in Arizona, they have cleanup bulls that run around because they're not as concerned about very, very high genetic merit cows as they are up here in Wisconsin. I think that's one thing. We're using semen from cows that we know are proven and can do what they can do, and it's timed, and that's probably helped some, the pregnancy timing and not waiting so long. I'd say the other part is probably the diet. We've made a lot of changes about how we feed cows. Using a total mixed ration, you're just going to have the capability by having more nutrients and better nutrients to make more milk because it's available. And I don't think we did that. It was let your cows out on pasture, maybe throw some hay up there or a salt block or if they need something, but we weren't feeding them at an optimal way to make them that productive. I think there's some other things that happen. Clearly, in the early 90s, we were interested in technologies that would increase milk yield. That was a big area of research from probably 1975 to 1995, very heavily, using various hormones, various different fatty acids, et cetera, to manipulate this. And one would be, the biggest thing would be bovine somatotropin or Posilac. And so growth hormone is primarily the galactopoetic or the maintenance of milk production hormone in a dairy cow, which is different than a human, which prolactin would serve that purpose. And that for a long time increased milk production quite a bit, and for a long time everybody was using it, or a lot of people were using it. And I think that is one thing from our field that came out of the mammary physiology world that helped manipulate that. Some other things that have changed are the milking frequency. We've studied a lot about the inputs and taking what we know in humans or what we know in other species. If you breastfeed more, you'll make more milk. That's what they tell you when you leave the hospital. Feed your baby as often as possible and you'll have more milk come in because you're not making much at that point. Another thing would be another big avenue of research that has helped quite a bit, I think, is the photo period and how people manage lighting in their farms and doing that in a way that it naturally influences the hormonal cycles of the animals so that they maximize what they can do in their mammary gland. I think that's part of it as well. But genetics, nutrition, I also think we house our animals better. They're in very comfortable freestall barns up here, or they're in huge dry lots out where I'm from. And that is another aspect of it, is that we manage our animals a lot better. We know a lot about what is going to be an issue, like heat stress. They're not going to breed back and they're not going to make milk no matter what you do for them because they're hot unless you cool them off. And so we've figured out things like that, and I think we're really doing well managing our animals to maximize the scientific achievements that we found over the last 20 or 30 years to ensure that, and I think that's why they do what they do.
Could you talk, I've never heard light period. Could you talk more about that, and does that also happen with humans?
Absolutely. So
Is that why there's lights around in the barns?
yes, so photoperiod is a really important part of lactation, primarily because it regulates prolactin. So photoperiod, and it's a little bit tricky to explain because you have to do kind of two different things depending on what stage the animal is in of her lactation. So I mentioned that while prolactin in a dairy cow is not necessarily the maintenance of the milk production, but it's absolutely critical to the lactogenic part. And if you don't get the lactogenesis part going, you can forget about having a really good time after that. So prolactin is going to help differentiate those cells, and it's going to help drive milk protein synthesis. It's really important for that. So when a cow is in her dry period or her non-lactating state right before she gives birth, she gets about a 40 to 60 day break to kind of hang out, relax, let her cells repair themselves. She gets some more space than she used to have. And we switch up her feed to make sure that it's what it needs to be during that time period so she doesn't get over-conditioned. And she'll be there. And what we do during that time period is we want to have them exposed to a short day photo period. So they're not going to get as much light exposure. And as a result of that, there's more melatonin. And that suppresses prolactin. So when the hormone prolactin decreases in the blood, all hormones act through a receptor. And if you don't have receptors there, it's like a lock and key mechanism. If the receptors aren't there, it doesn't matter if the hormones are there because nothing's going to happen. So what it does is as the hormone goes down, more receptors pop up, so they're available. And you do that during the dry period so that you have lots of receptors on the cells ready. Then the animal starts lactating, and you switch them to a long day photo period so that you can increase the amount of prolactin in the blood, and then you have more receptors, and that will help quite substantially increase milk yield. And there's also some thoughts that it also stimulates production of insulin-like growth factor 1, which is going to help those cells proliferate as well. And milk yield is absolutely 100% correlated to the number of mammary epithelial cells. The more mammary epithelial cells you have, those beautiful cells that Sam drew for you, in your mammary gland, the more ability you have to make milk because that's where the milk's made. So if you have less, you're already at a deficiency. And so that's how that mechanism works. So that's why people adjust their lighting. Sometimes there's a red light in there because they're working on their photo period. And again, that's a way to manage the reproductive cycle and the lactation cycle naturally.
You mentioned the Holstein and the Jersey cow.
Yes,
when
sir.
I grew up as a youth in rural UK, farmers often used to have birds and say Guernsey cow.
Yes.
Now the Guernsey, if I'm correct, produces high quality milk but low volume. Now my question is now 60 years on, or 70 years on, are these breeds like the Guernsey, are they being bred out of existence because of the demand for volume?
That's a good question. I don't know the exact answer. I know populations have decreased a lot. However, here in the United States, or specifically in Wisconsin, there are a lot of people who are very, very much dedicated to their breed. And a lot of people love the brown Swiss. They look like big puppy dogs. And they also have lower yield, kind of higher component milk, like a Guernsey does. And similar, there are people who are very dedicated to this, but I think they're more small-time farmers. And they might also be farms that are making maybe artisan cheeses and things like that because they can get more fat out of there and have better components, better protein for cheese making. But they're not going to be for the fluid level of milk. And then, of course, there's just those that are very dedicated to their breed and like to breed very nice animals that they use in their herds and such, but are still, like at World Dairy Expo, they still have a Guernsey show. They have a red and white show, which is a new breed, I hear.
You mentioned earlier that the Jersey was very temperamental. Has there been progress made in calming that down?
That's funny. Poor Samantha. Poor Samantha over here. She had to do a study. We were comparing Holsteins and Jerseys with our treatment because they do have more.
The answer is no.
Things haven't changed.
They're still temperamental. They're still sassy, but I think they've increased from about 8 or 9 million to 12 million in the U.S. I mean, they really are. In fact, Milk Source just put in a 4,000 cow Jersey farm up near Green Bay. And I kept telling Lou Armentano, one of our recently retired colleagues, he's like, no one cares about Jerseys. And I said, I think they do. They're interesting. And then one of the owners of Milk Source came to give a talk in our seminar, and he showed the first slide was the 4,000 cow Jersey farm, and he sent me this huge elbow, and he's like, I hate you. And I was like, that's okay. I told you Jerseys were cool. But no, they're really interesting, and there has been, especially due to environmental concerns and such, people are really looking at them because they really are more feed efficient. They give you much higher components, and they do not leave the environmental footprint just by sheer size. And so this is something that people are looking into, and then plus they are more heat tolerant. So if you have a cow that's not going to get as heat stressed, and you're having a dairy in Arizona, which there are, and they're big, why not use Jersey cows? And actually, our new herd manager, she used to manage a 3,000 cow Jersey farm in Arizona. So there's something to be said about that. But they are still very, very sassy.
When you create the 4,000 cow operation in Wisconsin, does that mean that that poor cow spends 24 hours caged up? Do they ever see the light of day? Because I really object to that method of producing milk.
Okay, so that's a good question. With a large farm, would you like a 4,000 cow dairy in Wisconsin? Clearly different than Arizona, where they're outside all the time. That's primarily their dry lot system, and this is a conventional housing freestall system. They do get out. I mean, I have not been to that farm. I've been to other large farms, and they set up their systems, their barns, so that they're able to go out and they're outside. Is it 24 hours a day? Absolutely not. In the winter, we wouldn't want them outside all day either, because that would be our extreme compared to the extreme of a Florida or a Arizona type summer. So they do get to go outside, not the way we used to think of. Maybe like I have a collaborator in Switzerland, and I go there and you see the cows with the bells running along the hill. I mean, that's the way you, or probably even Ireland. I haven't been to Ireland, but I can speak for Switzerland. So they do get out, and it's not all the time, but they do, and they get out on a daily basis. And even here, our animals are let out after milking anywhere from an hour to 3 hours, and they're out in their paddock, or they're at this facility on campus. It's quite smaller, but they do have an area where they go out and they walk, and they're able to be outside as long as the weather is not minus 35.
But I've read reports of cow operations in California where the cows do not get any exercise, and in fact, if they try to walk, they would be tripping over their own udder. Now, is this true, or is this fantasy tale? And why is it allowed if
right.
it does exist?
I don't think it is allowed. And just my comment to this is that, like humans, there are bad, like in the human situation where you have children that are in bad homes, there are bad people that farm and they don't do good things, or maybe not necessarily they're bad people, or they haven't been out on their farm, or they're not taking care of their workers or walking around their pens, because if they were, they would see issues at hand. And that a lot of times is a management issue, and sometimes it's just a bad person issue. And there's bad person issues everywhere, from having dogs to children to all kinds of things. So I think in rare instances that does happen, but those people don't stay around very long because it's not appropriate, and nor would you ever have an animal that was actually producing and doing what you need to do to pay your bills survive that in a way that you would actually be able to make money, especially the way milk prices fluctuate. Like this year, it's $13 a hundredweight. You have to be a really good caretaker of your animals and your farms and your people to make money or to live, to eat on something like that. So I'm sure there are bad people. I believe it. And those people usually get caught and they don't continue on. But we do try to make sure that that doesn't happen, and most people aren't like that. So, and if they were, they would not have farms that were successful.
This is certainly outside the U.S., but in the Provence region of France, they seem to take pride in all the different flavors of milk that comes out, because they make all these different kinds of cheeses, and the idea is spring tastes different than summer and than June, etc. So they have different
Grazing,
tastes.
that's right.
Yeah, I mean, how does the United States has made a decision to have everything homogeneous?
Correct.
And France, at least from what I can tell, doesn't.
Right. So largely,
How does that work there? I mean,
well, the European Union has different standards clearly than we do on what is okay in food, how they want food. They have their own version of what the FDA and the USDA say to us. So we also have guidelines that we have to adhere to that are put in part by the government when you're selling fluid milk or cheese, like just regular cheddar cheese and those kinds of things. There are farms, I mean, there are farms here. There's a great farm. She's from the Netherlands, and I worship her cheese. I believe her name is Mariska. She makes the Gouda cheese, and it's at Brennan's, and she is fabulous, and her cheese is fabulous, and she has this farmstead where she sells her cheese, and she does this specifically for that. So there are those places. But I don't think as a United States population we have as many people, probably, and I could be wrong, but we don't have as many people like in France or Switzerland or other places that have a palate for these different kinds of things. They want cheddar, or they want Swiss, or they want brick cheese, or they want very standard things. So it just kind of depends on the situation you're in and what the market is, and that is largely regulated by the USDA and the FDA and what those standards are. So, and the European Union has different standards, so it just depends. And then the other thing too is they sell a lot of raw cheeses, and that's another situation. And so we have to be careful with all of these variables when we're dealing with it, and it largely has to do with what the government does or doesn't allow.
I just wanted to say, I recently attended a panel discussion at the Wisconsin Historical Society. They had makers of alpine type cheeses there that are local people. One was from a larger outfit, but the other three were from smaller producers. They discussed, apparently in Switzerland they have a term alpine, talking about basically the terroir, the various flavors of cheese depending on what region, what mountain you're on, that kind of thing, the different shrubs that grow there. But, they discussed the fact that, the cheese, especially the fat content of what you can manipulate, it varies during the year, and they have to adjust what they're doing according to that. But they do try to produce, particular styles of cheeses that are different for each of these producers. And, they're getting results that are just as good as the European cheeses.
Absolutely, and I think we're starting to see more of that, actually. At least having lived here, there's a lot of different cheeses. You can go to a lot of different places and try a lot of different things. I'd probably, and again, have not been to Vermont, but I would believe it's very similar in Vermont and upstate New York and some of these larger dairy areas where they do have that. But there's also the expectation that you have to have these other things that, the fluid milk or the cheddar cheese or the regular kind of conventional cheeses that we're used to. But I think people are starting to want more of that. And so that does happen. But it's kind of a newer thing than, say, the conventional way. And so, but we also still have to adhere to the standards that are expected based on what we send off in a bulk tank and what the processor is looking at and those kinds of things too. So
the alpine cheese makers actually had to fight to get approval to use the traditional copper
pots
that they use in Switzerland, and they even actually flew FDA people out to Switzerland
to look at that. Right.
But it makes a difference in how the cheese tastes.
Right.
I
wonder if you use any RFID monitoring of cows to your input of your studies to see what effect it has on milk?
That's a great question. So with the wave of new technologies, we do have RFID tags. All of our cows have RFID tags on them in our herd, and most farms do to keep track of them. A lot of this stuff gets entered into different dairy databases. The big one here would be Dairy Comp to monitor milk components. Largely, they're on a bulk tank basis. Sometimes they have individual cows where they're taking individual milk samples to look at that. We now also have these things called SCR collars, which are activity monitors. And you can put, I'm not kidding, I'm doing a study right now and we have them on our cows. They're collars that you put on the cow, and the way they detect their activity, so they know how often they're walking. And they know when they come into heat based on some of their activity, and they can track that. And there's a microphone that they place by their ear, and when they eructate, that means that they've just chewed their food and swallowed it, and then they spit it back up to chew it again. They can hear the burp noise in the microphone, and it can track how long or how many minutes the cow is actually digesting its food. And so we make use of a lot of these new technologies to they have things where they have like locomotor monitoring. They have all kinds of things that you can do. A lot of people, particularly out of Canada, UBC and Guelph, are doing a lot of these studies where they monitor the actual what's the best way to say this? How the cow feels, so to speak. So they're trying to assess ways that you can identify a cow maybe showing a sign of distress before she got sick. We have a grad student who's working on different isolation studies in calves to see if they do better in a group or not a group and how they get sick, and they monitor what they put video cameras. And they have data loggers to see how much they're walking. And so they're trying to get at better ways that we can understand how the cow, so to speak, feels or is acting, so that we can identify these things before even maybe something happens to them. And so we really are trying to use lots of different technologies in combination with the physiology things that we normally do to understand how the cow works and give her an even better and healthier life than she has. So. Fitbit. They do basically have Fitbits. Pretty much. Pretty much. So yeah, me too. They have something. And a lot of them, they have them linked to iPads. So the grad student who's working on this calf project, she has everything logged in 2 iPads, and a lot of stuff links up directly into there, and she's trying to understand the behavior of the animals and how they interact. And we've also moved more to group housing animals. So calves, they're not so much, they're in hutches for a little while when they're highly immunocompromised, because as I mentioned earlier, calves basically are born without any immunity. So they need the colostrum and a little bit of time to develop their gut into a rumen and be healthier. So after they get out of that time period, they move them into a group so they can socialize. And we do that with the cows. They move in their groups through their periods, and they have their buddies that they go along life with, and they are social animals. So we really have worked on how to group them appropriately as well, so that they can have a good life while they're making milk. So.
Well, to follow up, do you do social network analysis of the cows?
I think that's some of the stuff. This one grad student, she's working with a professor at Ohio State who studies heifers and adult cows, and I think that's part of what they're trying to understand how they socialize. And there's definitely a dominant cow in the group. She's the one that gets to the bunk and gets the good feed as fast as she possibly can. So they do have a hierarchy. They really do in their networks. So. Well, thank you for coming.